Hi, this is John Walbarger in Philadelphia. I am a poet with four books of poetry, and I teach a poetry workshop at the University of the Arts. Um, so today I want to give a workshop on the Underglimmer. So this workshop should last 1 hour. So this idea is based on Bashow's Underglimmer, which was just a word that he used in one of his poems. So there's a handout to go with this workshop. So maybe I could just give a basic overview of the idea of the Underglimmer before we dive into some prompts. I want to do at least 3 prompts, and also give some examples of poems which talk about the Underglimmer. So let me say first of all, this idea of the Underglimmer for me is just about encouraging poets to look. I feel like there's no use in us becoming fancy with form and having all sorts of razzle-dazzle ways of writing poems, like to be able to write beautiful sonnets and iambic pentameter and all the tricks that poets know. It's not really any use if we're not looking at the world and gaining things from the world. So there are many ways to look at poetry, of course, but the one way I've been thinking about a lot lately is just that we as artists and poets should be looking at objects and sustaining our gaze. We're very distracted now with our social media, our phones, and we're all very busy. Even though these devices are supposed to give us more time, it seems like we're all rushing around and we have less time than ever. So as artists, I feel like it's important for us to develop a kind of sustained gaze and looking at things, which I think was perhaps the way Basho lived his life. So yeah, and then the idea is that as you look at something, almost anything, something happens in the mind. Like, it almost feels like an exchange between the object, the coffee cup, and the looker. There's an exchange back and forth, and the mind, as it rests, kind of can go to new and fascinating places, which it feels like those more interesting places are where poetry lives. So we can think about the daytime brain, which is the brain that feeds me and clothes me and gets me to work on time. And then there's a kind of nighttime brain, or like the reverie. Think of the French word rêve, which means dream. So the poetry mind, I feel like, is one that's like the reverie. It's the nighttime brain. It's not exactly logical. It's not the kind that gets me on the bus and the kind that even feeds me, but it's the kind, it feeds my soul. It's the kind, it's the mind that that goes for a walk by myself and then feels very whole and very complete. So it's about opening up that part of our minds and then writing poems from that place. So let me get to this idea of the Underglimmer. If you can look at the first page that I've handed out. So this is a Basho-inspired workshop, so I'm going to connect to Basho in a second. But first of all, let me look at the very top there. It says etymologies. Now, I love etymologies because etymologies are the background of words, so where words came from. And a lot of English comes from, of course, Latin and Greek, and Latin to German, and French and Italian. So let's look at these words. Glimmer. So this word glimmer, it's important to us, but it's not so much the central word here. So if you're looking at something, you're looking at the coffee cup, then something happens. Now, the idea is, I don't want to tell you what you see because we all have different brains, but as we look at that coffee cup, you can think of it almost like a kind of like a light comes through. Now think if you're bored and you're going to work or you're going to school, or maybe you're a little upset, somebody steps on your foot, you're not happy. You're not seeing much glimmer at that moment. You're not seeing much of the inner workings or connections between the objects around you, right? But if you can go to that nighttime place, the illogical poetry plays, then you can start to see the glimmer underneath the coffee cup. So this is the idea. So glimmer. So this is from early 14th century. Shine brightly, from Old English gleam, which is brightness, or shine faintly, to shine dimly. Glimmered, glimmering. Okay, now the word I think which connects a bit more closely for us, for what we're talking about, is scintilla, which is a great word, right? So you probably know, you might know the word scintillate or scintillating. So you could say, like a performance, you see Brad Pitt in a movie, you say, was that a good performance by Brad Pitt in Once Upon a Time in Hollywood? You could say, yeah, it was scintillating, which means that there was a spark or a glimmer there. It means more than just meets the eye. So this scintillating, the sense of the under fire, is the spark or the glimmer that's underneath the surface world of things, is what we're focusing on today. So to continue with scintilla, this is the least particle or trace, and then particularly I'm interested in particle of fire, spark, glittering speck, or atom. So you sustain your gaze, and you look at the cup, and then some particle of fire or spark, some glittering speck or atom comes up. So what is this? And one question that I'll bring up is, are we just projecting onto the world around us when we look? Is it all our ego? Or is there a kind of exchange back and forth? Now, some people, like John Keats, talked about negative capability. And John Keats basically implied that he was a romantic poet around 200 years ago, that we basically kind of erase ourselves, like Shakespeare erased himself as a person so that he could become completely objective. So this idea of objectivity or subjectivity is interesting in poetry. Do we really want to hear poetry where the poet is just projecting themselves onto everything? Like in eco-poetry, there's a kind of anthropomorphization that we do, where we just project the human world onto the animal world. And then we have, Disney movies where dogs are walking around going, hello, how are you? So this idea of, as humans, we just project ourselves onto the world around us is a somewhat dangerous idea, because it allows a kind of claiming of all those things that we project ourselves upon. So this idea of not claiming and trying to be objective implies, I feel like, a bit more communality with nature, like allowing nature to just be itself. So this is part of the idea, just trying to let the coffee cup be itself when you look at it, not to just project all your thoughts onto it. So if you just go down the page, this what pertains to the pine tree, just underneath the etymology, is the section by Basho. So let me just say about Basho that, let me just introduce Basho very, very quickly and say that, Basho was a Japanese poet, and he's famous for making these little haikus. He was around in the 17th century, and in what was called the Edo period. So first of all, let me just say that this idea of Underglimmer, is somewhat famous, but not actually very famous. And it's not an idea it's not actually an aesthetic, like a Japanese aesthetic, like wabi-sabi is an aesthetic, or a tea ceremony is an aesthetic. So this is just a kind of an idea that I like from one of his poems that is kind of famous, but not very famous. And let's remember always, when we take from other cultures, wabi-sabi or duende or Underglimmer, to remember where it came from. We can't just claim it. We have to always give credit to where it came from. So this is just a kind of an idea of mine that is inspired by an idea of his. So it's mostly mine, but we always have to keep that distinction between appreciation and then appropriation. So we don't want to claim it as ours. We want to just appreciate it. So we're keeping the appreciation for Basho in the room. So Basho, at some point, after a while, he became an old man, and he was walking alone on what was called the Edo 5 routes, which in medieval Japan were very dangerous. And so I think he always expected to die, but then he just kept not dying. So he just would walk and walk and walk and come back with these books of poems. He'd just write in his little book. And part of what he wrote was almost like eco-poetry. It was like a poetry about the world around him. In prose, like a commentary on the world around him, these Edo five roots. And then also he would write these little tiny poems as well. So his books were combinations of the prose and then the tiny poems, kind of back and forth. So this is from one of his books. So this is Matsuo Basho. So this is what he says. What pertains to the pine tree, learn from the pine tree. What pertains to the bamboo, learn from the bamboo. To do that, you must leave behind you all subjective prejudice. Otherwise, you will force your own self onto the object and can learn nothing from it. Your poem will well up of its own accord when you and the object become one, when you dive deep enough into the object to discover something of its hidden glimmer. However well you may have made your poem, if your feeling isn't natural, if you and the object are divided, your poem will not be true. It will be instead a subjective forgery. So this is the basic idea that I would like to talk about. So if you dive, so you're looking at the cup and basically saying what pertains to the cup, learn from the cup. If you dive deep enough into the cup, then you can discover something about the understory of it, which he calls this hidden glimmer, which we're calling the underglimmer. He says, if we project ourselves onto it too much, then it will be a subjective forgery. Now, so the idea with this is, basically, this is a question, like, are objects animated at all? Probably, animals are, other people are, but objects maybe not so much, right? But so what it's about is just us thinking in a different way, shifting our perspective. And I feel like if we can get into this poetic reverie, we're not so much just looking at objects as figures of utility. The cup is no longer just about, it's got my coffee in it. It's not just about coffee, but it becomes something else. It becomes an object in its own right, and it starts to become an object of beauty. And we start to see the connection between the different things. So the things on the table start to link up. So it's about accessing that reverie part of our own brains. And then following the object, like seeing what it's telling you. Is it telling you anything at all? Okay? So let's see. The next thing that I would like to do is to read a poem by Tracy K. Smith. Let's dive into that, and then I want to give you a prompt. So I'm going to give you 4 poems which are examples of looking. And I feel like looking is a kind of attention on something. So it can be a direct attention, like in the case of this poem Dusk that we're going to look at, it is Tracy K. Smith looking at her daughter. In other cases, looking can be listening, or it can be a memory, or it can become even something more ephemeral. So by looking, we're just saying, focusing our attention. So let's look at this poem first called Dusk. Tracy K. Smith was the Poet Laureate of the United States and is quite an amazing poet. Still alive. I think she's she's younger than me. I think she's in her 40s. Okay, Dusk. What woke to war in me those years, when my daughter had first grown into a solid, self-centered self? I'd watch her sit at the table. Well, not quite sit. More like stand on one leg, while the other knee hovered just over the chair. She wouldn't lower herself, as if there might be a fire, or a great black blizzard of waves let loose in the kitchen, and she'd need to make her escape. No, she'd trust no one but herself, her own new, lean, always jittering legs to carry her. Where exactly? Where would a child go? To there alone. She'd rest one elbow on the table, the opposite one to the bent leg, skimming the solid, expensive, tasteful chair. And even though we were together, her eyes would go half dome, shades dropped like a screen at some cinema the old aren't let into. I thought I'd have more time. I thought my body would have taken longer going about the inevitable feat of repelling her. But now I could see, even in what food she left untouched, food I'd bought and made and all but ferried to her lips, I could see how it smacked of all that had grown slack and loose in me. Her other arm would wave the fork around just above the surface of the plate, casting about for the least possible morsel, the tiniest grain of unseasoned rice. She'd dip into the food like one of those shoddy metal claws, poised over a valley of rubber bouncing balls, the kind that lifts nothing, or next to nothing, and drops it in the chute. The narrow, untouched hips, the shoulders still so naive as to stand squared, erect, impervious, facing the window open onto the darkening dusk. So, I'm not going to talk too much about this poem, but just notice that Tracy K. Smith, or the speaker in this poem, is looking at her daughter. So there's the looking here. If we can look at this poem in terms of the looking, the speaker is looking at her daughter. And notice the close observations of the object, which in this case is the daughter. Her own new, lean, always jittering legs to carry her. She'd rest one elbow on the table, the opposite one to the bent leg, skimming the solid, expensive, tasteful chair. So you can see that the poet is looking very, very carefully at the scene. We believe it. Like the details are there so that we actually believe that the person is looking. This is not an invented, fantastic situation in her mind. It's a grounded situation, grounded. So for us to be convinced that she is looking at her daughter, she needs to give us these details, which she does. Another thing is, the daughter, Tracy K. Smith, remember that Basho says not to learn from the pine tree, but not just to project yourself onto the pine tree, not to force your own self onto the object. So in this case, it seems like the Tracy K. Smith poem, Tracy K. Smith is actually projecting herself onto the daughter. She doesn't need it to be objective. She's not giving an objective portrayal of the daughter, but she's saying she's learning about her own mortality. The dusk at the end seems to be her exclusion from her daughter. So what she does is she looks at the daughter very carefully, and she ends up learning something about herself. So this is a bit different from Basho, but it's a type of looking. I feel like each of us have to find our own way of looking and whether or not we want to be objective or how objective we want to be. But trying to be objective seems like a very good goal. But there's no type of failure. It's just try to look and then see what you come up with your poems. So I would like to do a prompt right now. So your professor is going to give you an object of some kind. So the first thing I would like you to do is spend 2 solid minutes with this object in silence, just looking at the object. Don't write anything. Just let the room be quiet and just let your mind wander on that little thing. You can touch it if you want to. You can observe it in different angles, but maybe don't think too much. Just look at the object. So this is the first part of the exercise. So that's 2 minutes. Then, after that, for the next 5 minutes, I want you to write about that experience of looking. Okay? So do that workshop, and then we'll continue after that. That prompt.